So I've done a little bit of scouting of the Philadelphia Eagles, and I have to admit that especially since the NFC Championship game, I have done a little bit of mythologizing about the Eagles, building them up and sort of comparing what I thought was the Chiefs to what I thought was the Eagles. And I was a little more worried about this Super Bowl than the last two Super Bowls, which just goes back 3 years, right? But uh, I do look at this team and think that they are more beatable than I had started this bye week believing. And I apologize that these notes are not really in any kind of particular order. They're just kind of a stream of consciousness. I would take a note, expand on it, and then kind of go on a note of the note. But one of the things to know about the Eagles is they only had 3 losses on the season. You probably knew that, but it doesn't do a ton of good to just dig through those losses because I don't know how similar those losses really are. That said, one loss that does stick out like a sore thumb is the week 2 loss that the Eagles had to the Falcons. The Falcons ended up going 8-9 on the season. And one thing that the Falcons did all game long was act aggressively. This was a very aggressive team versus the Philadelphia Eagles. And I think that that really contributed to the Falcons winning that game. The Eagles kind of all game looked like they were on their back foot. They never looked dominant through the entire game and ended up losing that way. The Falcons were going for it on 4th down. They were very aggressive on defense. They were aggressive with their defensive backs who were, instead of going for making the safe play, they were going for the pass breakup. And the Eagles offense never really looked to me to find an actual rhythm in that game. And, you know, I guess I hadn't really thought of it before, but the Eagles' running game is um, every bit as dependent on the rhythm as most passing offenses are dependent on rhythm. The Falcons sort of knocked that off, and I don't think that the Eagles were really able to get anything going. The Eagles were driving late to put the game away, and Barkley ended up dropping a pass out of the backfield. The Falcons got the ball back down 6 with 1:28 to play. They have such a dominant defense, and Kirk Cousins is, I think we would all admit, a middling quarterback in the NFL, the upper side of middling in the NFL. And I don't think that they were particularly worried, nor should they have been, about that Falcons offense at that point in time. But it was like 3 completions later, and the Falcons were already in the end zone, Drake London in the front corner of the end zone. Then the Eagles get the ball back with 34 seconds, and the Falcons were in prevent defense, and Hurts just took shots underneath, and then the one big heave that he had ended up being intercepted. That is one of the prevailing themes from this, is that if you make Jalen Hurts a pocket passer, their offense really struggles. And it's one of the things that I started talking about earlier this week, is that the Kansas City Chiefs might try to build an early lead, as we will see later in this, from a team that is very similar to the Kansas City Chiefs. They were able to build an early lead, and then the Chiefs might play keep away offense, hoping to convert first downs, because what that does for the Chiefs' defense is it takes away Saquon Barkley and it makes Jalen Hurts into a pocket passer, and that did not work very well for the Eagles when it happened during this season. And so maybe there's not too much to take away from that Falcons game. They were not, at that point in the season, yet a bad team, and you sort of one of the things that you see in the NFL every year is that even the teams that end the season as very bad teams, earlier in the year, they are often more competitive than they were late in the season. They lose the ghost, as it were. And the Falcons were not a terrible team on the season, ended up 8-9, but the Eagles could not keep that game together. They just never established themselves. I think that the defense for the Eagles never really put their foot down. The offense was kind of give and take in portions of that game, and they ended up losing it at the end, giving up a long drive with 1:30 to play, and then a long drive that took basically a minute of time off the clock. That was it. They were very deep passes. They were not very deep passes. They were middle deep passes between 10 and 20 yards. And that's another thing with this defense that we're going to talk about. The Eagles' defense is elite. They were first in the NFL, surrendering just 278.4 yards per game. They were also first in passing yards surrendered with just 174.2 yards per game. They were also 10th in the NFL with 104.2 rushing yards surrendered per game. So all along that defense, they were good against giving up yards. That said, if you're looking for comparisons to Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, this is what I was alluding to earlier. Baker Mayfield plays a similar type of football to Patrick Mahomes. He's not Patrick Mahomes, but if you go back to that, even all the way back to the Oklahoma-Texas Tech game that the two put up something like 1,000 or 1,100 yards of offense in a single game, it was kind of like watching a Mortal Kombat mirror match, right? The offenses just kept back and forth like a ping pong match because the two quarterbacks were both so mercurial, so dynamic, so able and willing to just fling it. And when the Buccaneers faced the Eagles this season, Baker Mayfield, the Bucs won 33-16. And Mayfield absolutely went off. He threw 47 times, completing 30 of those passes for 347 yards and 2 touchdowns. That is a monster day against a team that ended up only surrendering 274 total yards per game, 174 passing yards per game. So he doubled the amount of passing yards the Eagles gave up on average per game. But also, what was interesting in that game, what is interesting about that Buccaneers team is this. When Rachaad White, who's a Kansas City native, was in the game, the two were effective together. And it's worth mentioning here because Rachaad White's game is similar to Kareem Hunt. White only rushed for 49 yards in the game, but he had a 4.9 yard average, and the Eagles looked, while he was in the game, to be skewing towards the run. So interesting to know exactly why it was that the Eagles were seemingly so scared of Rachaad White. But it's a really interesting test case, that Eagles-Buccaneers game, because Mayfield plays similar to Patrick Mahomes. White is similar to Kareem Hunt. Mike Evans, when you look at him as a wide receiver, is similar to Travis Kelce. And Trey Palmer and Chris Godwin are similar to both Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy. And the Buccaneers absolutely smoked this Eagles defense. The Buccaneers offense went off to the tune of 445 yards, 6 yards per play, and they scored 33 points. That's a big game, and the defense for the Eagles absolutely looked nothing like it did for the rest of the season. The Buccaneers in that game were not as aggressive as the Falcons, but they were aggressive in their play calling, and they used that aggression to jump out to a 24-0 lead. If the Kansas City Chiefs are able to do that, they're just going to grind the clock until they have won their third consecutive Super Bowl. And looking at that Buccaneers offense, that is an interesting dynamic, because do I believe that Baker Mayfield is as good as Patrick Mahomes? No. Do I think that Mike Evans is as good as Travis Kelce? I think they're probably pretty similar, though Travis Kelce plays a position that makes him more difficult to defend than Mike Evans. Do I think that Trey Palmer and Chris Godwin are better than Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy? Well, Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy are added up faster than Trey Palmer and Chris Godwin. I do think that Trey Palmer and Chris Godwin are a little bit underrated on the National Football League scale. But if I had to pick between the two, I think I'd pick Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy. And I don't think that the Buccaneers have someone that correlates quite as well to DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins not going to be making a whole lot of big plays, but is dependable to make plays. And he's going to want to make plays because this is his first shot at a Super Bowl. We'll see if he comes back to the Kansas City Chiefs next season in order to get another shot at the Super Bowl. But I think if the Kansas City Chiefs took their notes on this game between the Buccaneers and the Eagles, the Chiefs can execute that game plan better than did the Buccaneers. The one thing that was most interesting to me when watching that film was the amount of motions that the Buccaneers used against the Eagles, and they would use these motions in order to get a quick completion at the line of scrimmage for one of their speedy guys. The Chiefs haven't done as much of that this season as I think would be forecastable, right? Like if you looked at this offense and said, what's one of the tools they're going to use? They use all this motion. You would say quick hitters at the line of scrimmage, but I don't think they've done it as much as they could. And if they can get that done in this game in order to stretch the Eagles out from sideline to sideline, one of the Eagles' big weaknesses, like I said, is in the middle of the field between 10 and 20 yards downfield. So if all of a sudden this defense is paranoid about Xavier Worthy streaking across the field and catching the ball in the flats, man, Travis Kelce is going to have a heyday over the middle of the field because that is something that the Eagles showed time and again they have trouble stopping. With the big lead in place, however, the Buccaneers jumping out to that 24-0 lead, Barkley was kind of out of the equation. Hurts could not adjust to being a pocket passer to pick up yards in chunks, and the Eagles' offense never recovered. This is kind of what I was talking about with the Chiefs trying to get a two-possession lead. Obviously, all teams are always trying to get a two-possession lead, but should they be able to find themselves in that situation, they really take the edge off of the Eagles' offense and put their defense in a much better position. Now, paradoxically, what ends up happening is that when the Chiefs are playing defense against that Eagles offense, should Jalen Hurts be taken out of his rhythm and forced to be a pocket passer, all of a sudden he's going to be throwing more incompletions, which stops the clock, and the Chiefs will have to make up for that when they have the ball. So it is kind of self-defeating, but it's self-defeating in a sort of victory formation for the Kansas City Chiefs. And I'm calling it now. This is the second consecutive year that the Chiefs have been in a Super Bowl rematch. Last year, they rematched against the 49ers for the Super Bowl. This year, they're rematching against the Philadelphia Eagles for the Super Bowl. Guys, next year, it might be the Chiefs versus the Buccaneers in a third consecutive Super Bowl rematch. If the Bucs get there only to lose to the Kansas City Chiefs this time, that will be the ultimate vengeance. Moving forward with this thought process, though, the Eagles' passing offense was 29th in the NFL with 187.9 yards per game. But their rushing offense was second in the NFL to that historic Ravens rushing attack. with 179.3 yards per game. So basically a 50-50 split as far as yards are concerned between rushing and passing, meaning the game plan here is simple. Stop the run. But simple does not mean easy. If it were easy, Barkley would not have run for 2,005 yards this season. The Browns, however, surprisingly, did shut down Barkley. Versus Cleveland, he had 18 carries for 47 yards, a 2.6 yard per carry average. And there were a couple of games where he had yardage totals in the 50s. The Cowboys and the Steelers, I want to say it was. Both of those defenses, I think you can understand where the problems rushing the ball would come from. But the Browns were one that was really surprising to me, that they held Saquon Barkley to 18 carries for 47 yards. Now, obviously, they have Myles Garrett, but one edge player is going to have a tough task to end an entire rushing attack for the Eagles. So I went back and I watched and I read some of the analysis for the game, and watching it, it just didn't, like, nothing really jumped out. So I was reading analysis and nothing really jumped out. So I went back to the tape, and the only thing that I can kind of figure really worked for the Browns was that it came down to gap control. Though Jordan Mailata left the game with a hamstring injury, the Browns' defensive line did not dominate the Eagles' offensive line. They just seemed to play more efficiently. They did not get caught up pursuing the run, leaving the running game. So they left the running game without holes and without cutback lanes. And Saquon Barkley just kind of never found his footing. I think his long from the game was something like 12 or 13 yards, and he had a couple runs that were in that area, at least by memory. So he must have had roughly half of his production on like 2 runs. So the rest of the time, Saquon Barkley must have been absolutely cooked during the course of that game. The one thing that I will say from watching is that it looked like the defensive line was told, don't worry about Jalen Hurts. If there's one of these read option sort of plays, just go after Saquon. We'll let the linebackers and safeties worry about Jalen Hurts. And there were several times where Saquon Barkley was not given the ball. Jalen Hurts tucked it and ran, and the defensive end came crashing down and just obliterated Saquon Barkley from the backside of the play anyway. And if that's an effective strategy, that's an effective strategy, and I would hope that the Kansas City Chiefs do employ that, because it seems like they were saying Jalen Hurts is not fast enough or dynamic enough to gash us in the running game. He'll get his yards, he'll get some first downs, but Saquon Barkley's likely to take off for 50 at any point, and we don't think Jalen Hurts is going to do that. So the front four just always concentrated on Saquon and made sure they got him to the ground, whether he had the ball or not. And it seemed like it really wore on that Eagles offense during the course of the game. The last thing that I will say here, the Eagles defense is super confusing. They did really well, really well versus the pass this season. We already talked about that, giving up just under 175 yards per game. But that defense gets absolutely gashed in the mid-range over the middle of the field. It must have been half the yards they gave up this season, just going through and sort of watching different games and how things went for the Eagles defense. It must have been that half the yards they gave up this season in the passing game were right over the middle of the field, 10, 15, 20 yards downfield, to a player where there was just no one around him. So Travis Kelce could have a big day. We could see this be where Xavier Worthy starts to make some of that cash over the middle of the field for the Kansas City Chiefs. If Xavier Worthy, what I'll say is this. If Xavier Worthy catches one of those crossing patterns 15 yards down the field that I saw 30 players catch against this Eagles defense, he's going to turn the corner and go because there were no one around these players. Now, the defensive backs did a good job collapsing on the ball, but these players were wide open. Now, if it's Juju's going to get tackled. If it's DeAndre's going to get tackled. If it's Kelce, probably at this stage in his career, Kelce's going to get tackled. If it's Hollywood, if it's Xavier, those guys are gone with that type of opening over the middle of the field. That's what I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other Kansas City Chiefs fans. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, the Chiefs are the only thing I talk about on the channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. We're approaching 2 consecutive years of daily uploads on the channel. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.